This came in quite early on. It was actually involved into one of your slides discussing about the secular pro-life website, and it was discussing restrictive and prohibitive abortion laws. So I'll read out the question to you. How can reports that restrictive prohibit abortion laws do in fact reduce the number of abortions be trusted beyond good estimates due to the lack of reliable data from back alley terminations?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and just to reiterate, do feel free to head off if you need to, or to go to the bathroom, or whatever you do outside. You won't be judged. On this question, there are a number of different questions to look at. There are a number of different ways that economists look at the abortion rates when there are kind of restrictive laws, and there are a number of different restrictive laws. So some of those laws simply ban abortion after a certain point. Some of them restrict public funding to abortion. Some of them don't actually restrict abortion at all in the sense of stopping someone getting one. They just say, in order to get one, you have to have an ultrasound first, or your parents have to be informed, or something like that. And time again, economists who have looked at these kind of laws and the impact of them have shown that once you take into account the best data we have from backstreet abortions and so on, it does seem that abortions don't seem to take place as much as when abortion is freely available without any of those kind of protective laws. I appreciate that in some cases that can be difficult to do with complete accuracy because of the possibility of backstreet abortions. The first thing I would say to that is that most estimates of backstreet abortions in jurisdictions where abortion is much more restricted, the estimates for numbers of backstreet abortions are nowhere near the numbers of known legal abortions in jurisdictions where abortion is freely available. And there are any number of instances of that you could give. In the UK, for example, we have pretty good kind of estimates, even by pro-choice advocates, of the number of backstreet abortions leading up to legalisation of abortion. And those estimates were kind of agreed on by the pro-choice side, and nevertheless those estimates were hugely outnumbered by the number of legal abortions that occurred after legalisation. But one of the most direct ways I think we can look at this question is by looking at studies where people do actually turn away women who are over the gestation limit from an abortion. So there's a study called the Turnaway Study by a researcher called Antonia Biggs, and she's a pro-choice researcher. She essentially was looking at the impact on mental health for women who had an abortion around the gestation limit for abortions, and then the impact on women who were refused abortions because they were over the gestation limit. And what she found, and she didn't really report on this, but it's in her data, was that of those women who were refused abortions, she followed them up very closely and actually said, what did you do after you were refused an abortion because of the legal restrictions? Some of them did go and have abortions in other states, and some of them probably had illegal abortions as well. But actually, the large majority of those women who were refused abortions because of the legal status, the vast majority of them had the baby and continued the pregnancy to term. And we know that because they said, I continued the pregnancy to term and I have the child now. And so that's a very clear example of how we can tell that certain restrictive abortion laws can actually have an impact on whether abortions take place. And that's quite a direct way that doesn't need to rely on estimates of backstreet abortions.
Great, thanks for that. So I'll read this out. This is a bit of a weirdly worded one. Sperm is a loving human cell. Skin cells are living human cells. Why does an embryo have rights but a skin cell does not?
Yeah, thank you. Was that first bit living human cell or loving? Loving, okay. Well, yeah, I guess that's probably true in some way. So the question here, there are a couple of ways to approach it. One of them is very technical and goes into kind of philosophical disputes about identity. If you're very philosophically inclined and you want to kind of speak more about that, I'd be happy to do it afterwards, but at the risk of losing the audience, I won't go into detail on it now. The reason, really, that sperm cells don't have the same human rights as, for example, early embryos, is because one of them is a human being and one of them isn't. Now, that might seem arbitrary to some people in some ways. It might seem odd that fertilization can have such a radical impact on moral status. But actually, I think most of us would agree that at some point in pregnancy there has to be a radical change in moral status. So everyone will have some kind of view about when humans become equal human beings. And whatever you think that the moment humans become equal is, whether you think they become equal at 5 years old, or when they become kind of a teenager, or whether they become equal at birth, or maybe in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, everyone believes that at some point something happens to make that human being equal. And if you look at it purely in biological terms, and you just look at it through a microscope, or you just look at the physical details, it will seem odd that any of those physical changes could actually have such a radical moral impact on the moral status of that person. So it's not a problem that uniquely affects the pro-life view. The pro-life view just says that you are equal if you are a human being. And in some cases that's going to be very intuitive. So most people here would believe that we are each other's equals because we are, roughly of the same intelligence, roughly of the same size, roughly of the same age, and so on. But throughout history, many people have denied that human beings have been equal, and they've pointed to things like lack of intelligence, or small size, or a different skin colour, to say that some human beings are not equal. And they would say it's very confusing, this idea that all human beings are equal, even the ones who are very small, even the human beings who look different to us, even the human beings who are very kind of mentally disabled or mentally unwell. How can you possibly think that those human beings are equal? Actually, what we've been shown in the last kind of 50 years or so by the social justice movement, by the human rights movement, is that no matter how unintuitive it can be, even when someone might be kind of very mentally incapacitated, very small, very dependent on someone else, even when someone looks very different to us or has very different capacities to us, we still believe that they have equal rights, not because they kind of have the same capacities as us, but simply because they are human beings. And that gives them equal status even when that can be quite unintuitive. And so the pro-life view really just says the same about all human beings, that all human beings have equal status, even when it can be unintuitive to think so. And because the scientific consensus is that a human being, a human organism, begins at conception, that is the reason that pro-lifers think that after conception a human being has equal value, because it is a human being, whereas a sperm cell is not a human being, and no scientist would say that it's a human individual organism. And so that is the reason why we would make that distinction, even though it can be a little bit unintuitive, and I appreciate that. One thing that I think is helpful in thinking about this is just purely looking at the empirical data. There was a Comres poll in 2017 in Great Britain, and it basically looked at abortion attitudes on a number of different indices. One of them was just, do you think the abortion limit should be reduced? One of them was, do you think there should be mandatory waiting periods, and so on. And what was interesting about that poll is that by far the most pro-life kind of cohorts in that polling data were women and people from lower socioeconomic classes. The discrepancy between men and women was slight, but it was there. It does seem that women generally were more pro-life than men in the UK. The discrepancy between socioeconomic classes is actually very stark, such that there was a huge difference between support for the pro-life position among kind of lower socioeconomic classes than among higher socioeconomic classes. So that, I think, helps just to put this question in context of what people actually think from different perspectives in life and from their experiences in life. And it helps to at least give some indication that the pro-life view isn't a kind of privileged man's view. In fact, the opposite. The most privileged men in that poll were pro-choice, and it was the opposite kind of person who was most likely to be pro-life. The reason I think men should speak about this is fundamentally because I think privilege is real, and privilege comes with responsibilities and duties. This might be surprising to some people who think that most pro-lifers are very conservative and don't believe in the idea of privilege. Of course I believe in the idea of privilege. I'm privileged as a man, I'm privileged as someone who has a good education and who has a very secure place in life for the most part. But what we have learnt from, I think, the discourse about privilege and the discourse about social justice is that privilege itself isn't a bad thing, and it's not something that means people just have to keep silent about everything. In fact, the opposite is true. If we look at every other instance of social justice and instance of privilege, privilege comes with responsibility, and it means that people with privilege have certain powers that they should use to protect more vulnerable people. Privileged people have louder voices, which they should use their positions and voices to look out for the more vulnerable people, so that privilege turns from a bad thing or a neutral thing into something which helps support the most vulnerable people in society. And so, in this way, I think privilege is actually very relevant here, because as you would have guessed from the talk that I've given, I think some of the most vulnerable people in society, as well as women, and as well as people from kind of lower socioeconomic classes, some of the most, probably the most vulnerable people in society are unborn children. And so it would be an abuse of my privilege, I think, to not say anything about them and to allow them to have their lives ended in the case of 200,000 a year in the UK. I think that would be an abuse of my privilege. Now, that doesn't mean I have a right to just ignore the kind of suffering of women or the suffering of poorer people who are in very difficult situations. It doesn't mean that I can just say, you shouldn't have an abortion and ignore it. Rather, I should use my privilege both to stand up for vulnerable people in the womb, but also to stand up for vulnerable people who are in crisis pregnancy situations, who are in vulnerable economic situations, so that I can support them as well. And that's why I think a properly pro-life response has to look out for the unborn child, but it also has to look out for women. And that's why you've seen today coming in the stand, Both Lives Matter, really has this at the forefront. It says that both lives matter so much that those people who do have privilege and who have resources, who should share them, actually are going to start sharing them, and are going to share them first to stand up for vulnerable people in the womb, but also to stand up for vulnerable women in very difficult situations. And I think that follows directly from principles of social justice, that those people who have privilege and power and a voice should not just be silent, but should use their voice to stand up for the vulnerable, and also use their voice to give a voice to people who don't have one. So I hope that makes a bit more sense. Thank you.
I've seen on social media something that pro-choice people think proves pro-life a weak position. In a burning building, who would you save, one child or 100 embryos?
Yeah, another tough question. There are lots of very pragmatic answers to this. So a lot of the discourse I see about this is kind of facetious, and a lot of pro-lifers would just say, well, I'd save the person because if I had 100 embryos, what would I do with them? Like I still wouldn't be able to give them life because I don't have the conditions to be able to do that. That I don't think quite gets at the heart of the question, which is really about this intuition that if you would save a kind of adult human being or a 5-year-old child over 100 embryos, you can't really think that those people are equal. You can't think that they're equal in status or dignity to each other. It is a challenging objection, but I don't think it's one that really gets to the heart of the matter. And the reason is this, that pretty much everyone believes in equal rights and equal dignity and equal value of human beings. But also pretty much all of us would make decisions in those sorts of cases based not on the kind of intrinsic dignity or value or equality of human beings, but based on other practical considerations. So if you take a different example, suppose you're in a burning building and you find one person who is completely unconscious. You don't know if they will survive. You think they probably wouldn't make it anyway. They don't have any friends, they don't have any family, they don't have anyone depending on them or anything like that. And as far as you know, they might well pass away during the fire anyway. By contrast, you might have a woman there who is completely conscious, who you know you can save, who has 5 children that she's looking after at home, and a large social community. Pretty much all of us would say that those two human beings are fundamentally equal. We would say that when we base decisions on human equality, which is still a lot of the time, those human beings are equal in dignity and value and their basic fundamental rights. But sometimes we have to make decisions when there really is a moral dilemma, when we have two awful options. We have to make decisions on the basis of things in addition to fundamental equal rights. And sometimes those can be very pragmatic things, like who can I save, who is the easiest person to save. Sometimes it can be on more difficult things, like Does this person have anyone who is dependent on them? Do they have a family who need them to survive, and so on? The fact that we can make decisions based on those other considerations doesn't mean that those people aren't fundamentally equal, because we would all say that those people are fundamentally equal in their basic rights and their basic value. But that doesn't stop us from making decisions in genuine moral dilemmas about who to save based on other more kind of practical or social considerations. And so if you do think in the burning kind of lab scenario that you should save the 5-year-old child rather than 1,000 embryos, you can think that for reasons like the child is more likely to survive, you don't know what would happen to the 1,000 embryos, the child is part of a community who would miss the child may have, or the adult may have people who are dependent on them. You can make a decision based on those considerations, but nevertheless still hold that all the human beings are fundamentally equal, and those two aren't necessarily in conflict, even though it can be a difficult kind of legal and moral situation to work out.
So I've kind of forgotten the burning mic here, so if anyone has a burning question and needs to get away, equally I've just given you the opportunity to pop your question to the front. So, anyone? Yeah, we'll just carry on, that's fine. So if life begins at conception rather than implantation, why are pro-life people not speaking out as strongly against contraceptives, which may prevent this?
Another good question, and I'm not just saying that because I say it to every question, it genuinely is. So I guess to some extent I disagree with the kind of factual premise of the question, in that for those, so there's a distinction between different kinds of contraceptives. There are some contraceptives which don't stop, which only act pre-fertilization and they don't cause abortion after conception. These would be things like condoms, femidons, diaphragms and so on. Barrier contraception is a classic example, but there would be other examples as well. There would be other cases of contraception where we are actually very confident that it works post-fertilization, even if not all the time or most of the time. Some of these probably act post-fertilization some of the time. And probably the best example of that is either an emergency copper coil or probably even a kind of regular, non-elective copper coil. There are some contraceptives, perhaps most contraceptives, which would be somewhere in the middle where the evidence actually isn't very clear either way and where there's significant dispute about it. The pro-life position, I think, does say that we should be careful about those contraceptives which do act post-fertilization. So as a doctor, I would not feel comfortable using an emergency copper coil because I think there is a good chance that it would act post-fertilization. And actually most pro-life doctors that I know of and most pro-life activists that I know of do oppose the use of emergency copper coils for that reason. When it comes to more controversial contraception, things like certain progestogen-only pills, those pro-lifers who do think that they work post-fertilization and do cause abortions actually do oppose them. You probably won't hear about it much because contraception is so widely accepted in our society and is such a kind of routine part of the healthcare framework, but many pro-lifers who do think that those contraceptives work after fertilization do oppose them as well. And then of course for contraceptives that don't work post-fertilization like condoms, the reason we don't oppose them is because they don't act post-fertilization. Now of course, just a shout out to the Catholics in the room, there are Catholics and actually some Protestants as well. I have some Protestant friends who oppose any form of contraception, but that is for different reasons than necessarily because it causes abortion. And they would give different arguments for that. I hope that gives a kind of systematic overview of the different kinds. But yeah, feel free to ask more later if you want.
I have a request to ask more spicy questions. Okay, I'll do my best. So you mentioned in the talk itself that you agree that when the mother's life's in danger, that would be an exception where you think abortion is allowed. You took a more utilitarian stance there. What about the other exceptional circumstances in the 3% category that you mentioned? Those those who were conceived through rape or incest. Would you consider those ones to be should abortion be legal for those cases, or what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. That's a much more difficult question and a very good one. And as I kind of suggested with the polling data that I pointed to earlier, these are the kind of questions that really divide kind of the debate a lot more, and that actually society is much more divided over. So most people in Northern Ireland support legal abortion in the case of rape and incest, and they don't support abortion. Most people in Northern Ireland oppose it in the case of socioeconomic cases. And so these are really the kind of difficult questions and the extreme cases for the pro-life view. And they're of course the ones on which the Supreme Court rulings have been based recently in the last couple of years as well. The first thing that I would say about this is really to just kind of clarify, this is a very small proportion of abortions, and often people who have been in this situation say that they don't like having their circumstances and their experiences and their stories almost weaponized in some cases to argue for much more permissive abortion laws. That's not to undermine those experiences and those people who have had those experiences and do support abortion reform, and those people are certainly there and have their voice and their place at the table. But many people who have been in these circumstances say, I don't want my experience used to argue for actually abortion on demand, which is the reality of the kind of advocate's position in most cases. That's one thing to say at the start. The second thing I would say is that these are an extraordinarily small number of cases. So estimates for abortions for sexual assault are somewhere between about 0.1% to 1% of abortions. Again, that is not to undermine them, and that 1% matters because those women matter. And it absolutely is unacceptable to say that these cases don't matter because they're a small proportion, but again, it's just to put it in context. So we come then to the kind of crux of the question of what are we supposed to do in those situations? And so the question I then have to ask as a clinician, as much as anything else I do, is what is the thing that is causing the trauma to the women, and will abortion help heal that trauma? That is the fundamental question. Something traumatic and immensely distressing and painful that I can never imagine has happened, and that will always be there in the story of that woman's life. And the question is, given that awful circumstance, what is the best response to it that helps the woman to heal best? And then I think we have to firstly listen to the stories of women who have been in that situation, and then look at the evidence about women who have been in that situation. Now, if you read the stories of women who have been in these situations, what we find is actually quite surprising. There's a book called Victims and Victors by David Reardon, which goes through about 200 women who have been raped or been the victim of non-consensual incest. And some of them had abortions, some of them kept the child. What David Reardon found when he interviewed some 200 women was that almost everyone who kept the child, in fact everyone who kept the child, I think, was glad that they kept the child. And they weren't just kind of relieved that they kept the child or glad that they kept the child. They actually said something far more profound, which was that the child was the only thing that brought them healing. It was the only way that they could get some sort of redemption or healing or hope out of such an awful situation. And those voices, I don't think, are very often heard in this debate. What he then found was that when he spoke to women who had been the victim of sexual assault and had had abortions, is that very frequently they regretted having the abortion. And they gave different reasons for this, but one of the reasons was that it seemed to just compound the trauma. It added a second trauma to the initial trauma that they had experienced. And it was a similar kind of invasive kind of sexual trauma that they had to undergo with abortion as well. And they very often claimed that it didn't help, and that actually in many cases it made matters much worse. There's not very good data on this on a kind of large scale, although as I said, there is data looking at mental health and abortion in general, which does seem to suggest that abortion is a traumatic event that does seem to be associated with worse mental health outcomes. And so to go back to what I said at the beginning, my question I have to ask as a clinician is, given that this awful situation has occurred and that there's no way of just wiping it away, what is the best outcome from a horrible situation? Is it an outcome which kind of tries to do away with the initial trauma, but actually just adds a second trauma to the assault and adds a second victim to the assault? Or is it actually a very difficult option of keeping the pregnancy, which I would never want to underestimate the difficulty of continuing that pregnancy, but when we listen to the voices of women in that situation who have kept the pregnancy, they say very frequently that they say pretty much all the time that they're glad they kept it. Sometimes they keep the baby the rest of their life, sometimes they place it for adoption. But they pretty much always say they're glad they kept the baby, and they very often say that it was the only thing that gave them hope and that helped to redeem that situation and help them to find meaning in that situation, which we know is one of the main things that help people in trauma-type situations. So, all that to say, I think it's an immensely complex question, and I think it's an immensely difficult question, and I don't think any pro-lifer should ever just kind of brush it off and say, well, you know, the unborn child has a right to life and that's that. If we want to uphold that principle, which I do think we should uphold, we have to uphold it in a sincere and supportive and gracious and gentle way, and to understand just how we can help these women to heal. Women in these situations actually most frequently say that the reason they were caused distress by the pregnancy after being the victim of sexual assault is not because of the baby itself. In fact, it's quite rare for a woman to be kind of triggered or to find the presence of that child distressing in itself. The main thing that those women in that situation, according to a study by Macorn in a reference I can give later, the main reason those women found that pregnancy after sexual assault difficult is because of the stigma of society. They actually found that the thing they found most difficult was being judged for being pregnant in that situation and being unable to explain their experience and to speak to people about it. And that, I think, just gives a different context and a different perspective, that actually the solution, I don't think the solution is abortion. I don't think the solution is trying to deal with the trauma in that way. And if we listen to the voices of these women, and those are the voices I think are most important on this question, they also say that for the most part. And they say the real reason I'm struggling is because of the initial trauma and because people are judging me for this pregnancy and not supporting me for this pregnancy, which suggests to me that the answer, rather than abortion, is to support those people, to allow victims to explain their experience, and to give them the most compassionate, exhaustive, comprehensive support that we could possibly give them. Thank you.
So we had someone contact CMF before the event and said they wanted to give a short perspective on the story of someone going through decision making, going through making a decision to terminate a pregnancy. If you're here, we'd love, can you make yourself known to committee, and we can facilitate that. While he's actually in the room, we have a question involving our medical director. We were informed by our Director of Medical Education, Dr Kennedy, that if the decriminalisation of abortion comes into law, our curriculum at the medical school would reflect these changes. I am concerned that some of my colleagues would choose to opt out of this teaching due to their beliefs on termination. Do you think the medical school should allow students to opt out?
That's a difficult question for an entirely different reason. I'm aware of who's in the room, and I don't want to try and dictate Queen's university policy. What I would say is that actually, partly Christians, but also pro-lifers in general, my best friends at university are atheists, they're doctors now, and they're pro-life, so it's not only a Christian thing. But a common thing among Christians is, I think, wanting to kind of isolate themselves from these kind of circumstances and from these discussions and from these debates. And my perspective is that I think more than anything we should be involved in them. So when I was a medical student, as I said, I became pro-life in medical school, so I wasn't pro-life the whole way through. But by the time I was on my obstetrics and gynecology rotation, I was pretty much convinced. And we had a lecture on abortion. I decided not, I don't know if we could opt out. I don't think we could, but I went anyway, and I would have gone anyway. And what I found there was actually, it was a brilliant opportunity to challenge what was actually pretty awful teaching. And I have no complaint about saying that. I'm sure your teaching at Queen's is much better. When we had a lecture on abortion, we had essentially an hour-long propaganda by a professor of women's health or reproductive health, who kind of essentially blasted pro-lifers for the entire time, accused them of all sorts of things, kind of twisted the legal position of the United Kingdom on abortion, and all sorts of things. We caused I think I'd call it a polite fuss in that lecture. and just challenged her on some of the straightforwardly false things that she was saying. And actually that was a good kind of thing for the other students in the class. It was a good thing for the lecturer. I would say do it civilly, but it can be done. If someone is teaching something that is false and that you have the evidence suggesting that it's false, I'll give an example. She said that there were no studies on abortion and mental health which were prospective, which showed that there was a link between them. And we had citations of studies that were prospective that had links between abortion and mental health. And she just said there weren't any. We gave the citations, we raised it in a respectful and civil way, and that was fine. And then at the end of the course, we filed a complaint with the obstetrics and gynecology tutor, saying that she was very essentially rude towards pro-lifers and teaching some things which are straightforwardly false. And actually the obs and gynae tutor took that very seriously. She, despite being head of the termination services herself, actually listened to our concerns, put up some of our pro-life materials and arguments on the e-learning system, and then invited me to her son's school to give a kind of back and forth presentation on the ethics of abortion with her. So actually, I think engaging in these things can be very productive and can be a very helpful way of correcting false kind of information. And I'm not saying for a moment that you would get false information, because I'm aware of, I mean, I have no idea what you would be taught. Sorry, I'm going off a bit, but the key principles I would say are, if you have a conscientious objection to engaging in something, uphold that conscientious objection. You should not feel compelled in any way, and at least in Great Britain we have legal statutory protection against engaging in abortion or performing abortions or anything like that. The limits of those are somewhat being eroded, but we do have some statutory protection, and I'm sure your authorities, whether political or in the university, would allow you substantive conscientious protections. And so when it comes to engaging in procedures that you have an objection to, absolutely exercise those procedures, and I'm sure the university would let you. When it comes to teaching on this, whether the university lets you opt out or not, I don't think is relevant. I think whatever your view is, you should go to that teaching. And if you have a problem with it, if you find either the lecturer is being rude or they are giving factual misinformation, raise it civilly in the lecture. You can write a complaint afterwards, again civilly, and actually people do listen. And I know that for a fact that there are people within this medical school who are very sincere, very open-minded, very neutral, who would give you a proper hearing and who would be able and willing to listen to you and listen to your complaints if you did have them. I hope, and I'm confident, knowing some people at Queen's, that your teaching would be good. But if you do find a problem with it, don't opt out, go to it and raise those concerns civilly, and actually you can make a big difference.
Great. Before we ask another question from the text, would anyone like to, if anybody has to leave now or anything like that and has a burning question, please feel free to ask it now. We do have the roaming mic available. Are there any laws in place to protect doctors who do not want to engage in abortions directly or even refuse to refer onwards to an abortion provider? For medical students who are pro-life, would you discourage them from specialising in careers where they are most likely going to encounter abortion directly, for example, GP or obstetrics?
Yeah, that's really tough, and it will probably be different, at least in the meantime, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So in Great Britain, the situation is we do have very clear statutory and professional protection against directly participating in abortion procedures. That's very clear. I kind of mentioned earlier that the limits of that are being eroded to some extent, and what I mean by that is that midwives, for example, have been essentially forced by the courts to not participate directly in the abortion, but kind of do the preoperative care, or preoperative kind of ward management at least, which would indirectly facilitate abortions. And there's no statutory protection against that, and it's been taken to, I think, the Supreme Court. So when it comes to referring onwards, again, there's actually a legal and professional, I think, lacuna in that it's not actually very clear. So I'm actually trying to speak to the GMC at the moment about whether doctors do have an obligation to refer onwards. My position would be that in the vast majority of cases, there simply is no clinical indication for abortion, and also most abortions do not fulfill the legal requirements in the 1967 Abortion Act. So my position would be that whether I conscientiously object or not, the abortion simply is not clinically indicated and it is not legal in the vast majority of circumstances. When I put this to the GMC, they haven't published on this to my knowledge, but they said, even if you have a conscientious objection, you are too biased to actually make a clinical judgment, which I think is bonkers, but that's what they said. And so they said, because you are too biased to make an objective clinical judgment, you should refer onwards. Not really, and I spoke to a kind of top legal scholar about this who agreed that this doesn't really fit well with the rest of their guidance, and so it's a bit of a legal and professional kind of vacuum at the moment. But you don't have very clear conscientious protection against referring onwards in Great Britain. Most people would say you have an obligation to, at least professionally. All that to say, in Northern Ireland, if this law does go through, and I'm still hopeful that it won't go through, and that's something we obviously need to keep pushing politicians on, if the abortion law does go through, as far as I know, there are hardly any conscientious protections. As far as I know, it's a simple repealing of the sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act, and without putting in place anything about the regulation of abortion or about conscientious protection or anything like that. So if the law does go through, to my knowledge, there, at least in the beginning, there will not be any, or there will be very minimal conscientious objection protections. It might be that the professional bodies and the universities and the hospitals themselves give people conscientious protections, but as far as I know, there will be nothing statutory until perhaps in future the politicians decide to, at some point, kind of next year or so. It's a bit unclear at the moment, and as I say, I'm hoping that this law won't go through at all, but that is, to my knowledge, what is the situation at present. Oh, and on the question of whether you should specialise, that's a really difficult question. I can see arguments for both sides. What I would say is that one of the reasons the kind of pro-choice lobby has been so successful is because they have populated certain specialties and kind of pushed pro-lifers out of certain specialties so that the specialties become so robustly and institutionally pro-choice that it's difficult to affect them. And that affects kind of national campaigning, it affects politics, it affects global health and so on. And so I think it is important that we try and stay in specialties even when it can be very difficult. I can understand why someone wouldn't want to, but what I would say is that CMF, at least, whether you're a Christian or not, I'm sure they'd want to help. And they are trying to put together a support program for people who want to go into obstetrics and gynecology and keep their consciences clear of anything they disagree with. So there is support out there, and CMF are more than willing to offer it.
That's all right, quite a good follow-up question here, and then after this I'll have a couple more and then we can wrap up. And if you have any more questions, you can pass them, come down and speak to the Calum yourself. So if a doctor doesn't want to perform an abortion, does referring a patient to another clinician make them complicit in that abortion?
Another difficult question. I'd probably caveat my answer here by saying that I don't think I speak for all pro-life doctors, and I don't think I speak for all Christian doctors. Some of my very good friends who are pro-life and who are Christian disagree with me completely on this. So I wouldn't want you to think that this is the only possible view. My view is that referring onwards is being complicit in it. And that can be very difficult, as I say, because professional regulations, to some extent, seem to oblige people to refer onwards. Like I say, there is actually a professional kind of ambiguity here, and certainly a legal ambiguity. And so it's not really clear what obligations we have to refer onwards. My position is that I don't think pro-life people should refer onwards, because I think it is essentially referring them onwards to end the life of a human being whose life is worthy of protection. And just as I would never refer someone to someone else to have their lives ended, I think the same is true here. I think I wouldn't feel my conscience would be clear kind of just shifting the burden onto someone else. I would not be comfortable with that myself. that said, as I say, there are many pro-life doctors and many Christian doctors who do disagree with that, and so don't take my word as gospel, but that would be my perspective.
Okay, so before we get the last question, so a couple people have asked about resources and about getting a copy of the PDF or about just getting any of your references. Would that be available somewhere?
Yeah, so Michael has permission now to give my email address out to anyone who wants resources. So get in touch with Michael, or if you can remember it, my email address is c.miller@doctors.org.uk. I'd be more than happy to send the slides out, or to send, answer questions or give references. I didn't give the references here just because, for most of the things, just because it doesn't look very nice on a PowerPoint, but everything I've said here, I've got the references backed up at home. So if you do feel like you want to know more, whether it's on the scientific studies, or whether it's on campaigns, or whether it's on political stuff, or whether it's on anything to do with this issue, I'd be more than happy to share those resources and give you some pointers.
Great, so the last question here, I know you guys are dying to get away, but this is a good one. How do we support the joy of IVF, but also justify this by the permanent storage of, the permanent storage of or destruction of embryos which are not used after successful treatment?
Yeah, so another good one to end on. The IVF is not something that I know as much about, so I'm wary that I shouldn't be taken as an authority on this, and so if this is something that you are very interested in and you're really wanting to get an answer for practical reasons based on, I would check this out more and not necessarily trust this 100%. As far as I know, it is possible to do IVF with a very small number of embryos and then implant them all. I haven't found kind of an official source stating this. I haven't really looked for an official source stating this. And actually some people would deny it, that I've heard in kind of popular discourse. But on the other hand, I've met with at least 2 people who have said they had maybe 3 or 4 embryos created from IVF and they implanted all of them, even though one of them actually was, I think it was triploid, so it had kind of a 50% extra DNA. They nevertheless said this is a human being and we're going to implant it, knowing that it won't make it to term. That was a very principled view that they had, and it was a very difficult decision, but that was the principled view that they took, and they were brave enough to go with that. So obviously doing that comes with potential moral dilemmas of what do we do if we have an embryo which is very kind of serious, has a very serious kind of genetic anomaly. Doing IVF in those circumstances will always be immensely difficult and will come with huge challenges, but to my knowledge, I think, and again, don't quote me on this and go and look it up for yourselves, I think, having spoken to a couple of people who say they've been through this, it is possible to only fertilise a few eggs, only get a few embryos and implant all of them, whether together or one by one. So it's not necessarily something that Christians have to have, or pro-lifers have to have a problem with. But like I say, go and look it up for yourselves, or ask me a bit more when I've found it more. Thanks.
So before we wrap up here, I'll ask if you have any closing comments. But before you guys leave, don't forget to hopefully maybe pick up some resources for Life and I. Speak to both Life Matters. They've been here all night. And, we should probably speak to them. If you want any more resources, you can get it from them. And just after Calum closes, we'd also like to quickly hear from Peter Moore, who's going to plug the Life course, which is run at Uni Church. Thank you.
Yeah, it's already late, so I'm not going to keep you and do a whole conclusion. Just to say again, thank you so much for your patience and for being willing to stay here so long. Thank you for your difficult and challenging questions. And I hope that's at least given you some indication that this is something we want to take dialogue seriously on. We want to answer questions. We want to be in debate and discussion. And if anyone here still disagrees, we'd love to continue the conversation. If anyone here, well, probably some people here do agree, we'd love to help support you and give you the resources that you need as well. But I hope this isn't the end of the conversation.